Hello, in today's episode of Slim Shadetree Mechanics, we're going to change the wheel bearing out of a 2004 Ford Explorer. Now, to make sure that it is the wheel bearing that is bad, a good idea is to jack up the vehicle and grab the tire at the 12 o'clock and the 6 o'clock position and move it. And you can see that there's a lot of play in here. Now the next thing you're going to have to do is to take off the caliper. And there are two bolts that attach to the pins that make the caliper slide back and forth. The new wheel bearing hub comes with an ABS sensor, and the connector for it is right here behind the coolant reservoir. Disconnect that and get it out of the way, just in preparation for getting the hub out. Now, one thing I like to do is use a big zip tie and hold the caliper up and out of the way, just so that it doesn't put a whole lot of stress onto the rubber brake line. Now's a good time to take off the nut to the axle. It's a 30 millimeter socket. There are 3 bolts that hold the hub to the spindle, and to access them you have to get behind. The bolts are kind of hard to get to, and if you push the CV axle in, you can kind of get to the bolts. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the universal. I'm going to put it on one of these bolts, and then I'm going to use an impact wrench to try to get it off. This is not recommended to use a universal with an impact wrench because it can shatter, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. Because the impact had a hard time getting it out, I'm going to use a torch. Usually I like to use an acetylene torch to do this, but of course it's December and my acetylene torch was outside and the pressure got so low that I can't use it. So I'm using a MAP gas assembly with the wrong nozzle, so just to let you know. But it should still get the job done. Now remember, when doing this, be sure that you heat up the part that the bolt is threaded into. Don't heat up the bolt, because you don't want the bolt to expand. You want the part that the bolt is threaded into to expand. Okay, so now we got to get the hub off. The axle's nice and free, and what we're going to use is a hub puller. Now you need to get the whole housing out of the spindle. So what we're going to do is heat up the spindle itself. And this might take a little while. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up the inside of this spindle here. Make sure this is nice and clean, and then we're going to skim it with a little bit of oil, just so that the new bearing housing can get in there pretty easily. Okay, so we're going to get our new bearing hub assembly and make sure that it lines up with the splines, just like that. It seems like it's okay, and then we're going to see if we can get this pushed on there. And it seems like it pushes on there pretty nicely. Now when installing any bolt, I usually like to do it by hand as opposed to using an impact wrench. Basically, you just really want to see that the wheel bearing housing is pressed in all the way into the spindle. The next thing we're going to do is get the nut for the axle on there. I'm only going to snug this up. I'm not really going to crank it down because I'm going to need to have the wheel on the ground, and I'll show you how to torque it down to the right spec later. Okay, so while we're in here, it's a good time to do a brake job. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take out the caliper pins. You want to make sure that you use grease that's specifically for disc brake calipers. And the reason behind that is that you want to make sure that the grease has no petroleum in it. If the grease happens to have petroleum, it could break down the rubber. One thing I like to do is, after you get the pads in, is to spread out some of the grease on the outside of the pads. This enables the piston and the back of the caliper to push against the pads, but let them float a little bit so that nothing can bind up and everything's kind of free floating. We're going to get a 30mm socket, and we're going to tighten up this axle nut. Now the torque spec calls for 176 foot-pounds. I don't have a torque wrench that can go up to 176 foot-pounds, so I'm just going to set my torque wrench to 150 foot-pounds, and I might snug it up a little bit more after that. And I figure that that should be good enough. I'm going to put it on there, and we're going to see if we can snug this up. And there it is, 150 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do is now just snug it up just a little bit more, and we should be ready to go. Long day. Alright, so we got everything tight. Wheel spins freely. Bearing feels like it's okay, no defect. We're going to try the 12 and 6 o'clock position, nice and tight. So there it is. There's your dinner. Got it done. And now the wheel won't fall off.